Emily sat across from James in the sterile, echoing courtroom, her gaze piercing through him as if she were seeing him for the very first time. 12 long years of marriage, 2 kids, and now this bitter, heart-wrenching end. He looked almost smug, a triumphant glint in his eye that stung her more than the betrayals, more than the quiet humiliations she'd endured for the sake of their children and the family she fought so hard to hold together. A family, it seemed, that only mattered to her. James was walking away, leaving her for Sophie, a vibrant, self-assured younger woman who, in his mind, somehow understood him better than Emily ever could, despite her years of dedication to their home and their little ones. He showed no concern for Ethan and Olivia, as if they weren't his own flesh and blood, as if they were mere footnotes in his life. Sure, he'd pay child support, but with the bare minimum effort and, of course, the smallest amount the law would allow, just enough to keep Sophie in the lifestyle she expected. The judge's voice cut through the room, announcing the divorce decree, but to Emily, the words felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else's story. 12 years of shared dreams, hopes, and struggles crumbled like a house of cards in a gust of wind. But the real drama unfolded after the gavel fell. Egged on by Sophie, James dropped a bombshell that even Emily's seasoned attorney, Miss Charlotte, couldn't help but grimace at. With a challenging stare, he declared, "I expect every gift I've ever given you to be returned. Every single thing. For you and the kids." Emily was floored. She'd braced herself for many things, but not this petty, degrading demand. Return gifts? It was so small-minded, so utterly humiliating, that she could barely catch her breath. "Are you for real, James?" she asked, fighting to keep her voice steady despite the storm inside. "Dead serious," he shot back with a self-satisfied smirk. "I've shelled out plenty on you and those kids over the years. It's time I got something back, down to the last trinket." Sophie stood beside him, her smile sharp and predatory, clearly the mastermind behind this absurd request. It was obvious she wanted Emily to feel stripped bare, broken, to realize just who she'd lost. Miss Charlotte tried to interject, pointing out the ridiculousness of it all, but James wouldn't budge. He doubled down, and the judge, with a visible wince, noted his demand in the official record. Emily stayed silent for a moment, her eyes locked on James and Sophie. Instead of rage, a strange numbness washed over her. They looked so pathetic, so desperate in their greed, that she couldn't even muster anger. "Fine," she said at last, her tone calm and resolute. "I'll give back every last gift you've ever given us. Every single one." James's face lit up with a smug grin, clearly expecting a meltdown, tears, or pleading, but Emily refused to give him the satisfaction of seeing her crack. "But there's a catch," she added coolly. "I want everything documented, item by item, with a formal inventory and a signed receipt of transfer. I'm not having any loose ends or complaints down the line." James shrugged, indifferent to the details. "Whatever," he muttered. "Just get it done. Miss Charlotte, handle it, will you?" Miss Charlotte glanced at Emily with concern, sensing something beneath her client's composed exterior. She couldn't quite figure out what Emily was playing at, but she had a hunch there was more to this quiet compliance than met the eye. As they stepped out of the courthouse into the crisp afternoon air, Emily took a deep breath, the weight of the day settling on her shoulders. Ahead lay a daunting task, gathering up every birthday necklace, every Christmas toy for the kids, even the little diner mug from their first road trip to the coast. The kind of cheap keepsake you'd pick up after a greasy plate of burgers and fries at a roadside stop. She'd need to list it all, arrange the handover, maybe even deal with James showing up at her door with that same infuriating smirk, asking if she'd thrown in the old baseball cap from their trip to a 4th of July game. But Emily was determined. She'd face this head-on, just as she'd faced every late-night argument over bills, every rushed morning getting Ethan to soccer practice, and Olivia to school with packed PB&J sandwiches. If James thought he could rattle her with this nonsense, he had another thing coming. She'd play by his rules, but on her terms, and maybe, just maybe, she'd find a way to turn this petty game back on him. She's going to pull this off, and she's going to do it with style. Emily slid into the passenger seat of the car, adjusting her scarf as she turned to her companion with a determined look. "Hey, Miss Charlotte, I really need your help with something important," she said, her voice carrying a mix of urgency and resolve. "Of course, Emily. What's on your mind?" the seasoned lawyer replied, her tone warm yet curious as she glanced over while navigating through the busy downtown traffic. Emily's lips curved into a sly smile. "I'm planning to teach James a lesson he'll never forget," she explained, her eyes glinting with a mix of mischief and pain. "But it has to be flawless, airtight, not a single loose end for him to wiggle out of." Ms. Charlotte gave a knowing nod, fully aware of Emily's strength and sharp mind. She had no doubt that once Emily set her sights on something, she'd see it through to the end, no matter the obstacles. Over the next week, Emily threw herself into a mission of gathering mementos from her past with James. She rummaged through every closet, drawer, and dusty storage box in her suburban home, pulling out old photographs, trinkets, birthday cards, and even the kids' crayon sketches. Each item stirred a storm of emotions within her. Sweet memories of laughter over backyard barbecues with burgers and hot dogs, contrasted by the bitter sting of betrayal and heartbreak. Among the pile, she stumbled upon a faded photo of her and James from years ago, standing on a sunny beach, his arm around her waist, kissing her cheek with a look of pure adoration in his eyes. Tears welled up as she stared at it. Could all of that have been a lie? Did he ever truly love her? Then there were the kids' drawings. Ethan and Olivia had scribbled tanks, airplanes, and pirate ships for their dad. James had proudly pinned them up in his home office, boasting to his co-workers over coffee breaks about his little artists. She also found a birthday card he'd sent her once, filled with heartfelt words about how much he cherished her, how she was his everything, promising he'd never leave her side. As she sorted through these relics of a life once shared, anger began to simmer inside her. Anger at James, at Sophie, and at herself for letting them walk all over her. Yet, alongside the fury, a steely determination grew. She was no doormat, no helpless victim. She was a fierce, independent woman ready to fight for herself and her children. Ms. Charlotte stepped in to help catalog every single item, creating a detailed inventory that ranged from expensive jewelry to cheap dollar store knickknacks picked up during family road trips. Emily insisted on including even the small gifts James had given to the kids, like little toy cars and stuffed animals, wanting him to see the sheer ridiculousness of his demands. Once the list was finalized, Miss Charlotte made the call to James, coolly informing him that Emily was prepared to return everything. James couldn't hide his smug satisfaction, already imagining how he'd gloat to Sophie over a fancy dinner about his petty victory. Emily, however, requested that Ms. Charlotte arrange the handover at a neutral spot, perhaps the parking lot of the local diner where folks often met for a quick chat over pie and coffee. She refused to let James set foot in her home again, not after everything. The week leading up to the exchange passed in a haze of routine, dropping the kids off at school, grabbing groceries, and trying to ignore the neighbors' curious glances as she hauled boxes to the garage. Inside, Emily wrestled with a mix of relief and sorrow. Letting go of these tangible pieces of her past felt like shedding a heavy burden, freeing her from years of silent resentment and self-doubt. Yet, it ached to admit that the man she'd built a life with for so long could discard their shared history without a second thought. On the scheduled day, a small delivery van rolled up outside James's new apartment complex, where he now lived with Sophie in a trendy part of town. The driver and his helper grumbled under their breath about the wait as they unloaded a massive cardboard box, secured with heavy twine, onto the sidewalk. From his balcony, James watched the scene unfold, a smirk twisting his lips as he leaned on the railing, probably thinking he'd won some grand battle in this messy chapter of their lives. James felt a surge of triumph, believing he had finally gotten the upper hand by making Emily concede to his point of view. Little did he know what awaited him just beyond the door of his apartment. As he stood there, the delivery driver handed him the paperwork with a casual nod. "Hey, buddy, here you go," the driver said, passing the invoice to James for a signature. "This box weighs a ton, probably close to 65 pounds. Handle it with care, all right?" James scribbled his name quickly, barely glancing at the driver as he shoved the paper back. His mind was already racing with anticipation of the moment Sophie would lay eyes on the treasures he had managed to retrieve from his ex-wife. This haul was more than just stuff. It was a symbol of his grit and success, a way to prove he always came out on top. After the delivery guys drove off, James tried to drag the hefty box into his place on his own, but it didn't take long for him to realize he was out of his depth. With a sigh, he grabbed his phone and dialed Sophie, who at that moment was meticulously painting her nails a vibrant shade of crimson, probably sipping on a pumpkin spice latte, a seasonal favorite around here. "Hey, Sophie, sweetheart, could you lend me a hand?" he cooed into the phone. "I've got something pretty cool delivered, but it's way too heavy for me to manage alone." Sophie rolled her eyes, her freshly manicured nails glinting under the light. She wasn't thrilled about risking a chip in her polish, especially after spending an hour perfecting them, but curiosity about what Emily might have stashed away won over her reluctance. Together, they struggled to haul the box into the living room, grunting with effort. James, out of breath, collapsed onto the couch, wiping sweat from his brow. Sophie, arms crossed and unimpressed, gave the box a skeptical once-over. "What kind of junk is this supposed to be?" she sneered, her tone dripping with disdain. "I bet it's just a bunch of old rags and worthless trinkets. Why on earth did you even bother with this?" "Hang on, you'll see soon enough," James replied with a mysterious glint in his eye, reaching for a utility knife to slice through the packing tape. He pried open the lid and froze. Amidst the glimmer of jewelry, a set of luxury watches, and neatly folded designer clothes, his gaze fell on something unexpected. Hundreds of photographs, carefully bundled into stacks, each tied with a delicate ribbon. James pulled out one bundle, untied it, and stared at the images. There they were, smiling back at him. Himself, Emily, and their little ones, Ethan and Olivia, in happier times. One photo captured them at the beach, tanned and carefree, probably after a day of building sandcastles and chasing waves. Another showed them at an amusement park, laughing hysterically on a roller coaster. Yet another was taken at home during the holidays, unwrapping gifts under a twinkling Christmas tree. Hot cocoa mugs likely nearby on the coffee table. On the back of each picture, Emily's elegant handwriting noted the date, location, and a tender memory. "Our first family vacation. I've never been happier." Ethan was just 3 here, obsessed with cotton candy. "The best Christmas we ever had." A lump formed in James's throat as he set the photos aside and reached for another stack. This time, it was a collection of children's drawings, crooked houses, stick figure families, and bright scribbled suns. Each one bore a heartfelt message in a child's uneven scrawl. "I love you, Dad. Dad's the strongest. Dad's the best." Sophie, standing over him with growing impatience, couldn't hold back any longer. "What is all this nonsense?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to cut through the silence. Just a bunch of sappy old memories. I thought there'd be something valuable, like diamonds or gold, not this junk. James didn't respond, lost in the flood of emotions as he continued to unearth more from the box. There were stacks of old greeting cards he'd written to Emily in the early days of their relationship. Cheesy love poems, heartfelt confessions, and promises of forever penned in his clumsy handwriting. Then came a bundle of school notebooks belonging to Ethan and Olivia, filled with little notes of gratitude. "Thanks, Mom, for helping me ace that math test. Thanks, Dad, for explaining those tricky problems." The deeper James dug into the box, the more overwhelmed he felt, each item a reminder of a life he'd left behind, stirring a mix of nostalgia and regret he hadn't anticipated. James had come here expecting to uncover nothing more than material possessions. Items he could either sell off or hand over to Sophie as a gesture of goodwill. Yet, amidst the clutter, he stumbled upon something far deeper, the essence of their shared life, a tapestry woven with moments of joy and sorrow, triumphs and setbacks, love and tenderness. At the very bottom of the old cardboard box, tucked away beneath layers of forgotten trinkets, was a thick, worn-out folder. James pried it open and was met with a flood of receipts, hundreds of them, meticulously organized, from stores selling children's clothing, shoes, toys, books, and even enrollment fees for after-school programs. Each slip of paper was carefully filed and labeled with handwritten notes. Ethan's winter jacket, Olivia's new boots, English tutoring fees, birthday gifts for friends. Curious, James started tallying up the numbers. Within minutes, it became clear that the total amount Emily had spent on their kids over the past few years far outstripped the value of every gift he'd ever given, combined. Then, his eyes caught something else, a small, folded note pinned to the last receipt. Though it bore only a few lines, the words pierced through him like a sharp blade. "I've given back everything you demanded," Emily had written. Every photo, every drawing, every card, every notebook, every receipt, every piece of jewelry, every gadget, all the tangible things. But what you never offered, love, care, support, and attention, I've kept for myself and the kids. That's something you can never take away from us. The note slipped from James's trembling fingers. A wave of devastation washed over him, as if the room itself was crumbling around him. He stood there, surrounded by stacks of returned memories, and for the first time in years, he truly grasped the weight of what he'd lost. It wasn't the money or the objects. It was his family, his love, and ultimately, a part of himself. Sophie, still lingering in the doorway, cast a scornful glance his way. "So, what's the plan now, James? Gonna toss all this junk in the dumpster? Or just sit there wallowing over old snapshots while munching on leftover apple pie?" She sneered, her tone dripping with disdain, referencing the half-eaten dessert from last night's diner run, a typical late-night comfort food in their small town. James didn't respond. He just stared at the box, overflowing with fragments of his past, realizing the enormity of his mistake. He'd traded genuine worth for fleeting glitter, true affection for hollow admiration, and now he was left to face the consequences of his selfishness and short-sightedness. Sophie, tired of waiting for a reply, rolled her eyes, muttered something under her breath about needing a coffee to deal with this mess, and stormed off to the bedroom. She knew James wasn't in any shape to charm her, or even hold a decent conversation. Frankly, she was bored and repulsed by being near someone who'd morphed overnight from a cocky winner into a pitiful loser. Left alone, James sank onto the couch, sifting through faded photographs and crayon scribbles, rereading old letters and greeting cards. He wrestled with the question of how he could have been so blind, so deaf to the value of what he once had. For the first time in ages, guilt gnawed at him. He remembered how Emily had stood by him, how she'd supported him through rough patches, how she'd loved him despite his countless flaws. Shame burned within him as he recalled his betrayals, how he'd cheated, lied, and belittled her. But it was too late now. He'd single-handedly demolished their marriage, pushed away his children, chosen a path of selfishness and deceit, and all that remained was the bitter price of his actions. His gaze fell on a child's drawing, a simple sketch of him, Emily, Ethan, and Olivia, holding hands under a bright, scribbled sun. A painful reminder of a family brunch at the local diner, complete with pancakes and sticky maple syrup, a Sunday tradition they'd long since abandoned. The little misshapen figurines were painted in bold, childlike hues, their uneven shapes radiating a kind of innocent charm. In one corner, scrawled in a clumsy hand, were the words, "We are family." James couldn't help but remember this drawing. Olivia had given it to him as a birthday gift a few years back. He recalled how he'd patted her on the head, offered a quick, "That's great, kiddo," and planted a kiss on her forehead before diving back into his endless stream of meetings and business deals. Time with his kids had always been in short supply. To him, the priority was securing their future, providing the best schools, the nicest house, all the material comforts. The rest, he figured, was just trivial stuff. Trivial. Now, those so-called trivialities stared up at him from the floor, silently rebuking him for his short-sightedness. Sophie walked back into the room, her heels clicking sharply on the hardwood floor, breaking his reverie. "Hey, James, I honestly don't get why you're even bothering with all this nonsense," she said with a sigh, crossing her arms. "I thought you were made of tougher stuff, not someone who'd get all mushy over old junk." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. "Tougher stuff," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "And what exactly did you expect me to be? Someone cold as ice?" She rolled her eyes, gesturing dismissively toward the dusty box on the floor. "I pictured you as driven, unshakable, a real go-getter, not someone wallowing in sentimentality. Anyway, I've got to run. I'm late for a lunch meeting downtown." The door slammed shut behind her, leaving James in a heavy silence, broken only by the faint ticking of his pricey Swiss watch, a trophy from yet another corporate triumph. But now, that watch felt like nothing more than a hollow chunk of metal, a meaningless symbol of victories that no longer mattered. He sank to his knees, picking up a faded photograph from the clutter. It was him and Emily, laughing and holding each other close on their first wedding anniversary. They looked so young, so full of joy, brimming with dreams for the life ahead. He could almost hear her laughter, bright and genuine, a sound he hadn't heard in years. He'd drowned it out, buried it under piles of expensive gifts, designer bags, jewelry, weekend getaways, thinking that was enough to show he cared. He'd believed he could buy his way out of real connection, not just with her, but with the kids, even with his own conscience. But now, it was painfully clear. Love couldn't be purchased, trust couldn't be bartered for, and family wasn't a transaction. He unfolded a note from Emily, tucked at the bottom of the box. Each word sliced into him like a blade. "I've given back everything you handed over, but what you never offered, I've kept for myself and the kids." What hadn't he given? Warmth, attention, time, a shoulder to lean on. He'd been too consumed by his own world, his career, his ambitions, his ego. He'd thought money was the ultimate goal, but now he saw it for what it was. Just paper. True value lay in the intangible, in the things you felt deep in your chest, not in your wallet. His eyes drifted to a printout of Emily's expenses for the kids: school fees, extracurriculars, doctor visits. The numbers were staggering. He'd always prided himself on being the provider, the one who kept the lights on, but he'd never stopped to think about the hours Emily poured into their lives. He hadn't noticed the late nights she spent helping with homework, the early mornings driving them to soccer practice, the quiet moments comforting them through fevers and scraped knees. He'd dismissed it as her job, her role. He remembered a few months ago when Ethan had come to him, shyly asking for a new laptop for school projects. James had brushed him off, muttering about being swamped with work and promising to look into it later. Emily had stepped in, quietly buying the laptop with money she'd saved up for a new coat to replace the threadbare one she wore through chilly winters. It hit him then. She wasn't just his wife. She was the heart of their family, a mother, a friend, a rock. And him? He'd been nothing more than a paycheck. For the first time in ages, pride wasn't what he felt. It was shame. Shame for his selfishness, for his greed, for being so blind to what mattered. On impulse, he grabbed his phone and dialed Emily's number. The rings dragged on, each one twisting the knot in his stomach tighter. Finally, she picked up. "Emily," he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end. "What do you want, James?" she asked, her tone flat, guarded, as if bracing for another disappointment. He could almost picture her standing in their kitchen, maybe sipping a cup of chamomile tea, a habit she'd picked up to calm her nerves after long days, while waiting for him to give her yet another excuse. Her voice cut through the line, icy and distant, carrying a weight that seemed to chill the air around him. James stammered, his words tripping over themselves in a desperate attempt to bridge the gap. I need to say this. I was wrong, so wrong." His voice cracked under the strain of admitting it, each syllable a struggle to push out. She responded with a sharpness that stung, her tone unwavering. "You've always been wrong, James. But at this point, it doesn't even matter anymore." He sighed heavily, the reality sinking in like a stone. "I get it. I've lost everything. I've got nothing left." Her reply was final, a door slamming shut. "You lost it a long time ago. Goodbye, James." The call ended with a click, leaving him alone in his upscale downtown apartment, surrounded by sleek furniture and high-end gadgets, yet feeling utterly hollow inside. The luxury around him, polished marble countertops, custom art on the walls, meant nothing now. He realized he'd truly lost it all. His family, the love he once had, the trust he'd shattered, and worst of all, himself. Meanwhile, across town, Emily was carving out a fresh start. Her modest home buzzed with life and laughter, a stark contrast to the cold opulence of the past. Ethan and Olivia were hunched over their homework at the kitchen table, pencils scratching away while the aroma of a homemade shepherd's pie filled the air. A comforting dish Emily whipped up on tougher days like these. The place lacked fancy decor or trendy renovations, but it overflowed with something money couldn't buy: warmth and a sense of belonging. The walls were adorned with colorful crayon drawings, family snapshots from a summer barbecue at the local park, and little crafts the kids had made, cherished memories that radiated joy instead of the bitter regret that haunted James. As Emily stirred the pot on the stove, she glanced at her children and felt a gentle heat bloom in her chest. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, with bills piling up and the occasional squabble over who forgot to take out the trash. But they'd manage. They had each other. In that moment, she understood that true wealth wasn't in bank accounts or status symbols, but in the love and family surrounding her, something no one could ever strip away. Ethan wandered over, wrapping his arms around her in a quick, awkward hug typical of a preteen. "Mom, you're the best. You know that?" A soft smile spread across Emily's face as she ruffled his hair. "And you two are my absolute favorites," she replied warmly. They settled together on the worn-out couch, arms around each other, gazing out the window as the evening sky darkened over their suburban neighborhood. Inside, though, their little world glowed with light and comfort, fueled by the love and hope that anchored them to a brighter tomorrow. Later that night, the phone rang, and Miss Charlotte's familiar voice came through, full of concern. "How are you holding up, honey?" Emily leaned against the counter, a tired but genuine smile in her voice. "We're doing okay, Charlotte. We'll get through this." Miss Charlotte's tone softened with reassurance. "I know you will, dear. You've always been a fighter. I've seen it since day one." Emily's heart lifted at the words. "Thanks, Charlotte. I can't tell you how much your support means." Miss Charlotte chuckled lightly. "Don't mention it, honey. I'm just a call away, always." As Emily hung up, a quiet grin lingered on her lips. Knowing she had friends like Charlotte in her corner was another priceless treasure. She turned to see Ethan and Olivia dozing off on the couch, sprawled out after a long day. Gently, she draped a cozy blanket over them, tucking it around their shoulders, and pressed a soft kiss to each of their foreheads. Switching off the living room lamp, she curled up beside them, exhaustion weighing on her, but contentment filling her soul. As she drifted off, a dream took hold. She stood atop a vast hill, the wind carrying the scent of fresh grass, the endless horizon stretching before her. She breathed deeply, feeling unshackled and alive. This was her new beginning, a life free from betrayal and pain, brimming with love and joy. A life she had fought for and truly deserved.